the man who ruled the Soviet Empire for the longest time after Joseph Stalin. An educated man, affable and of silent intelligence, from university classrooms to Ukrainian lands, from the Urals to tank factories, thereby paving his way to total leadership of what was for decades a powerful power. Leonid Brezhnev comes to power in 1964 and thus remains for 18 years between a period of prosperity and another of relative stagnation. At times, he sought to return the Soviet Union to the old magnanimous Stalinism after Khrushchev's liberal reforms, while at other times he was a moderate man who understood presidents as bellicose as Richard Nixon. Some also claim that the Soviet Union regained part of its imperial vision and world leadership under the command of Leonid Brezhnev, walking a tightrope of great internal problems and forces that rather sought for Russia to adapt to Western capitalism. Today we'll learn his story. This is Reynaldo Carrillo inviting you to follow us on our new channel, The New Encyclopedia, where I will be narrating videos on a wide variety of topics, all very interesting. I'm sure you're going to love it. Here on the screen, the link will appear for you to see what we have posted, for you to get involved, to subscribe, and to learn and enjoy as much as we do. Without anything else to add, let's start with today's story. Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev was born into a working-class Russian family in Kamenskoye, Ukraine, on December 19, 1906. His parents were Ilya Brezhnev, a worker in the steel industry, and Natalia Denisovna, a housewife. It was a time marked by the end of Tsarism and the rise of Marxist-Leninist ideas in Russian factories, so his father's influence was fundamental in shaping Leonid's ideology. The Russian Revolution found in the young Brezhnev and in thousands like him the ideal breeding ground for the communist struggle. It was a time of change in Europe. A revolution overthrew the Tsar of the Russian Empire in 1917, and shortly after, the so-called Bolsheviks established the first communist state in the world after ending the lives of the Tsars and their 5 children in a basement. 4 years after these events, in 1923, Brezhnev is a 17-year-old with a Marxist mentality who decides to join the youth organization of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, also known as Komsomol, and 6 years later, in 1929, he finally manages to become a formal member of the Communist Party itself. By this time in the 20s of the 20th century, skilled and technical labor was in high demand. Many young people received different types of technical training. Brezhnev initially studied agriculture and land management and obtained the title of surveyor in 1927 at a technical school in Kursk. After this, in 1935, he obtained the title of metallurgical engineer and specialized in the iron and steel industries that were in eastern Ukraine. A curious detail his studies. Brezhnev works as an extra in a theater. His studies, Brezhnev works as an extra in a local theater, and in this theater develops talent for acting, histrionic skills, and an interest also in poetry. He concurrently pursues his political and military career. He begins with compulsory military service between the years 35 and 36 and takes courses at the tank school. After that, he acts as a political commissar in a tank factory, and by 1939, he is appointed secretary of the Communist Party for the Dnipropetrovsk region. But before we continue, we must remember that the Soviet Union, from its birth as a country, had been led by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Vladimir Lenin. Upon his death in 1924, power was already held by Joseph Stalin, and he would consolidate it in the following years. Shortly after, in the famous purges that part of historiography called the Great Purge, between 1937 and 1939, Brezhnev was able to advance quickly within the Communist Party and the state itself by ascending in the spaces that were becoming vacant. Brezhnev was a tempered man with a heavy brow and very bushy eyebrows. He studied his technical intelligence. His character generated trust in many of the friends he made during his career. He was affable in treatment and seemingly austere, although as he climbed, he overflowed his attachment to luxurious vices, the best vodka, the best cigars and cigarettes, the best whiskey, insatiable womanizer and lover of luxury cars that he drove at high speed around Moscow. But let's go back to the young and university student Brezhnev. By 1926, Brezhnev meets Victoria Petovna Denisova, whom he marries by 1928. From this union, their children Galina Brezhneva were born in 1929, followed by Yuri Brezhnev in 1932. Victoria, Brezhnev's wife, would accompany him until the end in his last days. Moving into the 30s and 40s, the Soviet Union with Stalin reaches a period of stability through iron political control and accelerated industrialization and collectivization of lands. But this is interrupted when the European nations embark on what the Russians have called the Great Patriotic War, also known as World War II. On the Ukrainian front, Brezhnev serves as a political commissar in the Red Army. His responsibilities include ensuring ideological and political loyalty within the troops, as well as maintaining discipline, propagandizing, and overseeing the morale of the soldiers. The Soviet Union, allied with the capitalist Western Bloc, wins the war, and in the following years, Brezhnev holds various important positions in the regional committees of Ukraine. After World War II, the capitalist Western Anglo-Saxon Bloc and the Soviet Russian Bloc divide the world into spheres of influence, and then begin what historiography has called the Cold War, in which both blocs seemingly enter an existential struggle for control of the planet. The truth is that in this new context, the undeniable technical ability of Leonid Brezhnev and his skills for leadership and dealing with people eventually brings him a new milestone in his career in 1950, when he is appointed as the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Moldova. His achievements in maintaining, deepening, and consolidating Soviet power, as well as promoting communism in those lands that had belonged to Romania until World War II and were then annexed to the Soviet Union, earned him a significant promotion in the high ranks of Moscow. Starting from 1952, one of the most important moments in Brezhnev's life arrives. In that year, he joins the Central Committee of the Communist Party and is a candidate to be a member of the Politburo, which was fundamentally the most powerful organ of the Union. However, Brezhnev's brilliant political career was invariably linked to the figure of Stalin. And it turns out that Stalin dies in 1953. During the institutional chaos for the selection of the new leader, Brezhnev loses part of his status, or at least sees his participation in the Central Committee and the Politburo reduced. Although in 1953 he accepts a position in the Ministry of Defense as head of the political direction of the Army and Navy. By 1954, the Soviet leadership landscape becomes clear. There was already a consolidated successor. Nikita Khrushchev assumes total power of the Soviet Empire. Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev were no strangers. They rather had an important link starting from their shared Ukrainian origin. Both came from there. Brezhnev cultivated that link and was rewarded shortly after in May of 1955 when he was appointed by Khrushchev as the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Kazakhstan. As we see, wherever the party needed a man like him, he went loyally. Since Stalin was in power, there was an internal struggle between reformists who believed that the Soviet Union should open up a little more to the West and capitalism, and those who clung to National Socialism of a more conservative and more Stalinist cut. Khrushchev was part of these reformist currents, and Brezhnev fully adheres to it. So when he came to power, Khrushchev launched the so-called Thaw period, a series of reforms that gave greater freedom in some aspects of the economy and politics, as well as the so-called process of de-Stalinization. Leonid Brezhnev, although it may seem contradictory as we will see later, was an important piece in this process of liberalizing reforms as a direct collaborator. These new Soviet policies under Khrushchev's command also included the promotion and expansion of agricultural production, so Leonid Brezhnev, as the first secretary of the Republic of Kazakhstan, had a simple but key job to succeed in the Virgin Lands campaign, in which Kazakhstan was a more than important territory. This campaign had a fundamental success, at least in its early stages, in which approximately 36 million hectares of land that were previously barren were cultivated, both in the territories of Kazakhstan and Siberia, in the Ural Mountains, in the Volga area, and the north of the Caucasus. With the success of the Virgin Lands campaign behind him, Brezhnev returns to the Soviet Power Center in Moscow in February of 1956. There he is elected again to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and is a candidate member of the Politburo. He also takes over the assigned control of the defense industry, the space program, the heavy industry, and capital. He becomes a heavy hitter in the workings of the state, earned on one hand by his talent and work, and on the other by his good relationship with Nikita Khrushchev. However, sectors in the orthodox and more Stalinist current of the Soviet leadership, contrary to the instability and the surrender of the Soviet Union and its sovereignty to the West, were betting on a palace coup. By May of 1960, Brezhnev is appointed president of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, a position that presents itself as the head of state. But in reality, Khrushchev held the power as the party secretary. So the year 1964 rolls around, and Brezhnev resigns from his post as president of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet to establish himself as the second secretary of the Central Committee of the party. This was Khrushchev's direct right hand. With this position, his growth in the political establishment had been such that he was already considered as the official successor to Khrushchev. What Khrushchev didn't know was that since 1963, Brezhnev had been involved in a plot to displace him from power. Despite Khrushchev's reforms, these were times of economic problems that were in the spotlight and that were putting pressure on the Soviet leadership. On the other hand, there was still the displeasure of an orthodox sector of the Communist Party that considered that Khrushchev was betraying Stalin's legacy and giving away the essence of the country. Khrushchev was not able to appease other internal groups that opposed him, several of which had already approached in this juncture, seized the opportunity to take the reins of this juncture, seized the opportunity to take the reins of power, and he who was once his leader, his support, his promoter became the enemy to be defeated, to be dethroned. So by the end of 1964, Brezhnev manages to gather a majority in the Politburo that votes in favor of Khrushchev's dismissal from his charge on the basis of a series of allegations of incompetence and corruption. After this, Brezhnev is appointed as the party leader and succeeds him in this position. But it wouldn't be him who would immediately take over the destinies in the Soviet Union, but he had to form a triumvirate with Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin and the current president of the Supreme Soviet, Nikolai Podgorny. This group, which had a critical view of Khrushchev's reforms, would be together until 1966, when Brezhnev manages to win in the power struggle and is elected as the General Secretary of the Communist Party Committee. He faced the challenge of stabilizing the country, revitalizing the economy, and increasing Soviet power on the international stage. Despite the apparent affinity between Brezhnev and Khrushchev on how to lead the Soviet Union, at the beginning of the so-called collective leadership of Brezhnev, Kosygin, and Podgorny, that nascent liberalization and decentralization of Khrushchev were replaced by policies of Stalinist tendency and more conservative and centralist cut. Even the influence and direction of the Politburo leaders was increasingly concentrated in the old party hierarchs, a sort of council of elders of the Soviet Union. This does not mean that Brezhnev was a pure Stalinist. He also understood with various figures of a more reformist, liberal, and centrist cut during his government, and his policies were a varied tendency, which also happens in foreign policy. While Brezhnev intervened aggressively in several to sign agreements with presidents as bellicose as Richard Nixon, as to sign agreements with presidents as bellicose as Richard Nixon, as we will see later. So at the internal level, from 1965 under the leadership of Brezhnev, a stage of economic improvements for the Soviet Union begins at the productive industrial level. The new policies begin to take shape. Factories and mines increase production by 138% compared to the 1960. And for that same year, the regional economic councils are abolished, which had been implemented by Khrushchev in 1957, and whose function was to manage the economies of the various regions of the Soviet Union to return to a policy of greater state directionism. In the food sector, improvements were not as high as at the industrial level, with a modest constant growth of 3%. This period of government during the 60s was one of strengthening employment and purchasing power, but would later turn into slow and even stagnant growth. In terms of foreign and military affairs during his term, there is an effort to rescue that Russian imperial vision of the Soviet Union within the delicate geopolitical game of the moment. Brezhnev has a prominent personal involvement in foreign policy. Stalinist doctrine also arose from a more interventionist approach. Brezhnev was determined to return the more interventionist policy. Brezhnev was determined to return the power that Moscow had lost over the satellite republics in recent years. By 1967, Czechoslovakia, which was made up of the current Czech Republic and Slovakia, carried out a process of liberalization of its Soviet communist system with the support of massive protests as well. This was known as the Prague Spring. This decision did not sit well within the government of the Soviet Union, and in response to this attempt at uprising from one of its republics for 1968, a Russian-Soviet military intervention takes place in Czechoslovak territory to crush the rebellion that produced more than 100 deaths. The leader of the Czechoslovak state was forcibly taken to the Soviet Union, and the reforms were abandoned. This would be the beginning of the so-called Brezhnev doctrine that affirmed, and the cases in which the essential common interests of other socialist countries are threatened by one of them. End of quote. The Warsaw Pact forces would be responsible for carrying out this type of interventions. Unlike the Khrushchev period, which sought to reduce the military apparatus, Brezhnev during the first years of his mandate increased defense spending by 40%, a fact that would make the Soviet Union practically equal to the United States in the arms race at the time. Brezhnev also more directly provides financing and military and propaganda equipment to countries that were in conflict with the West, both politically, diplomatic, and military. In general, during the first stage of Brezhnev, there is growth in terms of economic production, purchasing power, and the military and political influence of the Soviet Union. Another striking aspect of his first term, in 1968, was the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons between the Soviet Union, signing other treaties, both with Richard Nixon and with Jimmy Carter in 1979 regarding arms control. However, this last treaty with Jimmy Carter was not presented to the American Congress due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which we will mention later. Although Leonid Brezhnev takes elements from the old Stalinists and increases Khrushchev's internal control levels, the political system of domestic politics was inevitably not the same as in Stalin's time. The ideological disloyalty of previous years was still being punished. Any criticism of the system, the leaders, and even official literature were considered anti-Soviet propaganda. However, it did not reach the purge of the Stalinist era, a famous purge expulsion from the Stalinist era. A famous expulsion from this era was the renowned thinker Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Brezhnev was definitely a restrained man regarding domestic politics, who did not make hasty decisions, liked teamwork, listened to other opinions, but did not hesitate when it came to sidelining an adversary. We arrive at the second stage of Brezhnev, that of the 70s. For this decade, Brezhnev tries to distance himself somewhat from the more orthodox doctrine and seek a policy of greater détente with the West. He seeks to normalize relations with West Germany and reduce tensions with the United States, this through the international arms control treaties that we already mentioned, as well as the commitment to maintain international stability and in exchange to be able to promote greater trade between the Soviet Union and Western countries. More capital from the West would arrive in the Soviet Union, and in exchange it also had to inevitably open up little by little not only the capital but also the ideas, culture, and political currents of the West. By the 70s, as we have already mentioned, the Soviet Union had managed to level itself militarily with the United States in terms of strategic weapons, and the Russian army ends up consolidating as the largest in the world, a milestone that many still applaud Brezhnev for today. On the other hand, returning to local policy issues within the Soviet Union, Brezhnev does not eliminate all the reforms that Khrushchev had started. For example, he was convinced that the conventional methods used for the organization of collective farms worked. However, the growth in military spending, along with other obstacles of the state economic system, eventually led to a reduction in investment in agriculture, consumer goods industries, and health services, which led to economic problems in the 70s, such as shortages in numerous products and a contraction in wages and purchasing power. By 1973, the so-called era of stagnation arrives, an economic problem that would also be reflected in the social and political spheres. This second stage under the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev would be of slow economic growth compared to all its Western peers, and even with China as well. The 70s also witnessed various revolutionary processes on the African continent, and Brezhnev seeks without any type of Portugal in 1975. And during the Civil War, the Soviet Union supports the popular movement for the liberation of Angola that governed that country from 1975 to 1991. That same year of 1975, Mozambique, also a colony of Portugal, faces a bloody civil war where the Soviet Union supports the Liberation Front in the former Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe, between 1972 and 1979. Another civil war is fought, and the guerrilla led by Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo, leftist dependents, is also supported by the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, which sought independence in a clear challenge to the white minority in the region beyond the leadership skills of Brezhnev that would not prevent internal struggles in the Soviet Union for the year 77. Podgorny, the other member of the initial triumvirate, was forced into retirement, and his position as president of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union fell again on Brezhnev. The third leader of the group, Kosygin, does remain until his death in 1980 in the position of prime minister. In addition to all this internal situation, we are facing a stage of the 20th century of expansion of capitalism and consumer society as a way of life. The 70s see a growth like never before in the financial industry, capital funds, multinationals, which increasingly penetrate any nation on the planet, no matter how distant. The Soviet Union was no exception, increasingly inevitably influenced by the West. Fearing the loss of an ally in the region, Brezhnev supports the Soviet Union's military invasion of Afghanistan when a civil war broke out in that country between communist forces and fundamentalist Islamist forces that were supported by the United States. This intervention would not only end in a great Soviet failure, but in great sorrows, losses of military material, and lives of the army, not to mention the number of Afghan lives that were lost in this conflict that is sometimes referred to as the Soviet Vietnam. On the other hand, on the European side in the Soviet Socialist republics, democratic currents and various anti-Soviet tendencies were gaining strength. In Poland, massive demonstrations occur led by the Solidarity Union with Lech Walesa at the helm, and this Polish movement takes on vital importance. There was fear of a new intervention by the Soviet army in Poland, just as it had happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968. When these protests of the Polish anti-communist movement broke out in 1980, the rulers of Poland and East Germany advocated for a military action driven from Moscow, but these were different times, and Brezhnev did not see an intervention as appropriate. And finally, in the face of an anti-communist social movement that was becoming increasingly powerful, Warsaw imposed a curfew and martial law. However, this fact was key in the nations under Soviet influence, a key issue in the not-so-distant dissolution of this communist empire. This milestone in Poland also marks the last days of Brezhnev, who on one hand was still highly respected by his peers in the Soviet establishment, but for others had become somewhat vain and pompous, being decorated with medals of heroism without ever having fired a shot. Brezhnev, now 73 years old, showed signs of precarious health. His consumption of alcohol and tobacco had increased. The consequences of some medical problems, such as tremors and memory failures, were becoming more frequent. However, his appearances at public events continued. By May of 1982, he suffers a severe heart attack, which he survives, but which was followed by another heart attack on November 10th that would be fatal, finally ending the life of Leonid Brezhnev, and he is honored receiving the honors of head of state, followed by 5 days of national mourning. His remains were buried in the necropolis of the Kremlin Wall in Red Square. Only Joseph Stalin presided over the Soviet Union longer than Brezhnev. During the 18 years he was in power, the Soviet ship was besieged by the internal contradictions of a mega-communist state and by a world that was turning to liberal and capitalist values. On this tightrope between men who already missed the Stalin era with nostalgia and who wanted to open the country to the West, and that Russia would join a new geopolitical order, it is a historical process that still continues today with its current manifestations. History will be the judge of our protagonist. Thank you all very much for watching this video. I hope you liked it, and I invite you once again to subscribe to our new channel, The New Encyclopedia, where we will be publishing exclusive, unprecedented content of great interest on a wide variety of historical topics. Below in the description and in the comments, you will be able to get the link so that you can start getting involved and see what we have published. Also, don't forget to leave your comments on this video, give it a like, activate the bell for notifications, and follow us on our Instagram account called The New Encyclopedia. Without anything else to add, I say goodbye and may God bless you all.